Hello, this is Helen Morrison. Welcome to Speech as Complex Sound. This particular lecture is one of a series of lectures in speech acoustics. This series has been developed for professionals who work with children lost in their family, for students who are preparing for that sort of work, for parents of children with hearing loss. It has been designed with a particular intent to provide knowledge for professionals who are preparing for certification as listening and spoken language specialist, auditory-verbal therapist, and auditory-verbal educators. There are 5 lectures in this series, beginning with this one, Complex Sound. The second lecture covers anatomical landmarks, the creating of the voice and resonance. The third lecture extends the concept of resonance to talk about vowels and diphthongs. The fourth addresses consonants. And the final lecture pulls it all together in talking about audiometric considerations, speech acoustics, and the audiogram. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to talk about the acoustics of speech with regard to the audiogram throughout this series. It's also important for me to say that it is useful for you to begin with the beginning. The concepts in each lecture build upon one another, and if you're seeking to have a fuller understanding of the relationship between the movements of speech, the acoustic targets that those movements create, and how we perceive those in the understanding of spoken language through listening, then it's very useful to start from the first lecture and work your way through the 5th. Now, you may want to have a copy of the slides from this lecture. This link on this slide directs you to a Dropbox folder where you can find the slides for this and all the other lectures, as well as a reference list. The topics in this lecture we'll be talking about the 3 dimensions of sound, how we display 3-dimensional sound, because we'll be looking at some graphs, and it will be helpful for you to have a sense of why we're using those graphs and what they mean. And then we'll talk about sound in general, simple and complex sound. Speech is a complex sound, and the complex sound that is speech can be further classified as being periodic and aperiodic, and then we'll look at the sounds of speech and how they are classified with regard to these different kinds of sounds. Because once we start with that understanding, we can move more easily into thinking about the acoustics of speech. Now, sound is 3-dimensional, and this is probably, most likely, somewhat familiar to the listener. The 3 dimensions of sound are intensity, which are the intensity of sound is measured by dBSPL, or by dBHL, which are the decibels that are on the audiogram. We as listeners experience intensity as loudness. Another dimension of sound is frequency, measured by hertz, and we experience frequency as pitch. And then finally, the 3rd dimension of sound is time. Sound in general, speech in particular, exists in time. Once we say it, it's gone. And the act of perceiving speech is the act of perceiving a sound that, with regard to time, is impermanent and is very fast and is very quickly changing. And we measure the time elements of sound in milliseconds because sound happens so quickly. Now, because we have 3 dimensions to sound that we need to understand to have an understanding of speech acoustics, we have the challenge of displaying these 3 dimensions of sound. When we're trying to understand sound, our challenge is to display these 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional way, which is the page, or in this case, the computer screen. So we have 3 different ways that we're going to display this 3-dimensional sound in 2D. The first is the waveform, which is a display of sound intensity or loudness by time. So here's an example of a waveform here, and we have time, and then we have the intensity of this waveform over time. So those are 2 aspects of the 3 dimensions of sound. The next way that we display sound is the spectrum. In this particular case, with this spectrum, this is the spectrum of the vowel ah, and it's a display of just a small tidbit of time. And it's a display of frequency by intensity. And as we see all these bars here, each one of these bars represents a frequency component in the vowel ah. But if you'll notice, there are 1, 2, 3 frequencies that are of greater intensity than the others. And those peaks in the spectrum are very important to our perception of vowels. Now, if we move to the speech spectrogram, this is how we are able to display all 3 dimensions of sound, intensity and frequency and time, on a single page. Here is a speech spectrogram of the syllable wed. So time is this x-axis or this bottom dimension. And then frequency is represented along the y-axis or on the vertical axis. And the intensity aspect of speech is displayed in terms of the darkness in this display. So you'll see we have lots of information across the duration that the vowel wed is spoken at lots of different frequencies, but we have a particular intensity at 1, this frequency, 2, this range of frequencies, and 3, this range of frequencies. And these dark bands actually correspond with these peaks of energy in the spectrum at these particular frequencies. We'll be seeing in particular the speech spectrogram a lot across this series, and the more you see it, the more it will become second nature for you to understand what you're looking at. Now, sound in general can be classified into 2 broad categories, one being much broader than the other. So the 2 broad categories are simple sound and complex. Simple sound is comprised of only 1 frequency. We also call it simple harmonic motion, pure tones, sinusoids. A simple harmonic motion is the sound that you hear when hearing is being tested, a single frequency, the tones that are used in audiometric assessment. Simple sound, a single frequency, doesn't really exist in nature. We create those sounds, we generate those sounds for the purpose of testing hearing, for research in hearing. The sound of the real world is complex sound. Complex sound is sound that is comprised of more than 1 frequency. When we listen to the soundscape around us, we're listening to all sorts of frequencies. Speech is complex sound. lots of frequencies represented in speech. Now, if we compare some of these ways of displaying sound, it might give another way of understanding this dichotomy between simple and complex sound. This is a waveform of a simple sound, and in contrast, this is the waveform of a complex sound. Lots of jiggly lines here. This is the complex sound of the vowel ah that we've been talking about. If we look at the spectrum of a simple sound, we see that there's only one frequency represented at 500 hertz. And we contrast that with the spectrum of the complex sound for the vowel ah, which we've seen earlier. We are reminded that the vowel ah is comprised of a multitude of frequencies, with some particular frequencies having an especially great amount of energy. Now, the speech spectrogram shows also this complexity of sound that is speech, in that we have frequencies represented in these areas that are not very heavily shaded, but we have the representation in these dark areas of the peaks of energy. So, staying with complex sound, we can also further categorize complex sound to help in our understanding of the acoustics of speech. Complex sound can be categorized as being either periodic or aperiodic. And periodic sound, that waveform, repeats itself. The frequency content in periodic sound is specific. You can mathematically calculate the frequencies in periodic sound. You can determine what those frequencies are. And in periodic sound, when we're listening to periodic sound, when we're listening to aspects of speech that are periodic, much of our listening has to do with listening for a particular frequency content. The sounds of speech that are periodic in nature are our vowels, nasals, liquids and glides, and voice consonants, parts of some of the voice consonants. A rule of thumb, if you're trying to decide if a speech sound, for example, is periodic, is to ask yourself, can I sing it? I can sing ah for ah. For an M, I can sing mm. Even for an L, I could sing but I cannot sing an S, which is not a periodic sound. Other than the rhythm of maybe how I'm giving some emphasis there, you couldn't really guess what tune I'm singing there. That's periodic sound. Now, in aperiodic sound, the waveform does not repeat itself because the frequency content is splattered across the range. It's somewhat even randomly distributed. We can't do the kinds of fine, clean mathematical analysis to find out the frequency content of aperiodic sound that we can with periodic sound. We can further classify aperiodic sound into two types: turbulence and transience. Turbulence are noise, sound created by creating a turbulence in the airflow. The classic turbulent sound is white noise, a randomization of all particular frequencies. But fan noise is turbulent. The sound of the wind is turbulent. The sound of an H is turbulent. The sound of an S is turbulent. There's a broad range of frequencies represented, but they're not systematic. Now, Transients are very short, brief sounds, whereas a turbulent might be extending over a period of time. A transient is a very brief sound. It's a pop, it's a click. And when we have that click, we have a splattering of sound. If you listen to a cymbal striking in the orchestra, you can sort of hear the splattering of sound, which is that shimmery quality of a cymbal. It's one reason why we use clicks in testing infant hearing, in screening infant hearing, if you want to just get a broadband look at that infant's hearing. Now, in speech, how are our speech sounds classified with regard to turbulence or transients? Our turbulence classically are our fricatives. Our transients are plosives, and a combination are the affricates. So a turbulent might be shh. A transient might be t, 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 the T. The combination, the affricate combination, would be the CH. Ch, ch, ch. You have a little bit of transience at the beginning, followed by this turbulence. So let's look at some graphs. We have to the left a periodic sound. We have the waveform repeating itself. Here we have the vowel ah, so we have the waveform here for ah, a single cycle. And we have a copy of that. It's a little more intense. That's why it looks a little larger for the second cycle. And the waveform repeats itself here and repeats itself here. This, on the other hand, to the right of the screen, is the waveform of white noise, and you don't see that repetition in the waveform. We have the spectrogram of periodic sound, again, the vowel ah, which we've been seeing. And here's the spectrogram of a transient aperiodic sound. This syllable is a PAM, so it's a disyllable. And this spike right here, this vertical spike extending up and down on the spectrogram, is the explosion of sound as we quickly release air for the p. You can see it extends across the frequencies on this graph. There's not really one or two particular frequency represented. There's a little bit of depth that comes in here because we're transitioning into the vowel, but really it's just kind of a spike. Now that's a click. That's an explosion. That's a transient that happens with our plosives. Now here's an aperiodic turbulent sound on the speech spectrogram. The syllable is phi, and this all through here is the F, the f, and we see again a splattering of sound. It's represented across, almost equally across, a number of different frequencies. Again, we see a little bit of intensity through here and here where we have some transitioning into the vowel. But really, if we compare the f to the ah, it looks a lot fuzzier, sort of like the fuzziness and the turbulence with which we hear the F in speech. Now, we're nearing the end of this first little lecture, just to get us warmed up. And what we're going to do to summarize is to summarize by classifying speech sounds. You're going to see on this chart much of what we've just talked about to pull it all together. First, let's look at what sounds in speech are periodic. The vowels are periodic. The diphthongs, I, oi, ow, are periodic. Glides, liquids, and semivowels are periodic. Ya, wa, la, also ra, which is simply not on this list. nasals are periodic. We could sing through all of these. Now, what about the aperiodic sounds? The voiceless plosives, p, t, k, are transients. The voiceless fricatives, sh, s, are turbulence. Also included in that voiceless fricative selection can also be the h, the h. The voiceless affricates, ch, are both transients and turbulence. We would say that they're a combination of a plosive and a fricative. Now, when we look at voiced speech sounds, we see even more complexity here. Because when we add the voice, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture series, which is the vibration of the vocal folds, to these aperiodic sounds, we have to acknowledge that we've got this vocal fold vibration. So we're going to say that the voiced fricatives are turbulent. The z is turbulent. But because we are hearing the voice, and we can sing with the voice, it's also periodic. And I can sing z, I can sing with the z. The transient voiced plosives, because the voice is involved, and that is a periodic sound, are both periodic and transient. And when we get to the consonant lecture, we'll talk about where that voice appears in the production of the sound. And similarly, the voiced affricates, the j, are both transient and turbulent, and also periodic. Now, on the YouTube screen, there is a place for you to write comments. You can write questions there. You will also see at the footer of this lecture, as well as all the others, an email address where you can send me questions, and I can help you understand something that I may not have been fully clear on in my explanation. So that email address is helenmcmorrison@gmail.com. Our next lecture is with regard to phonation. We're going to say a few words about anatomical landmarks, the acoustics of phonation, how phonation, or the voice, is shaped by the vocal tract. And the voice, the phonation that's created at the vocal folds, that acoustic aspect is called the fundamental frequency. And we'll talk about some fundamental considerations about that fundamental frequency. Now, again, for a copy of these slides and a reference list, you can go to a Dropbox folder. The link is here, and you just follow the information on the screen for downloading the PDF of the slides. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about helping children with hearing loss and their families, you might go to the RecipeSLP.com website. We are launching a series of listening and spoken language strategies. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll join me for the next lecture with regard to phonation.